Okay, as we wind up the informal fallacy section of the course, that's Philosophy 1290 at the University of Manitoba with Phil Veltos. That's me. I just want to do a last few favorite fallacies of my own. So let's get to it. I want to do, and this section of the course I change up year to year. Whatever fallacies are kind of out in the world these days. And so right now with COVID, there's lots of crazy thinking going on. So I thought I'd do misleading precision, the naturalistic fallacy, Texas sharpshooter, wishful thinking, and fallacy fallacy. So starting with misleading precision, uh, and this is a fallacy where you create a false impression of confidence by giving misleading accuracy. So, in the example, economy is estimated to grow at 2.445% rather than saying 2.5% or even 2.5. Seems like someone's done a lot of math to come up with that number. And just that impression of being precise on a number suckers people into believing the evidence. Um, so this is also known as the over precision fallacy, false precision, fake precision, or spurious precision. All of these names are just saying, look, you're giving us unneeded accuracy instead of good reason. So, for instance, Donald Trump, uh, not even into February. So this is a while ago, right? And I chose this example because it's not COVID yet, but the cost of illegal immigration as far this year is then he's got like 18 billion, blah 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 blah, down to $68, and the cost on a specific day was 600 million, and down to the last $2. He's giving an exact number of illegal aliens, not the, and then notice he uses a round number as a estimate that other people use. That's what he's criticizing. So there's a bit of a straw man angle there. So now, does he know anything about these numbers? Uh, Someone fact checking that from PolitiFact. Um, Unclear where those numbers come from, and immigration experts and demographers refute to related estimates. Now, you could come up with these numbers, say, take the total number for the year and divide by 365. You might get that number. Then he's got a daily cost. I'm not sure where, I guess you would take the total number for the year and multiply that by 365. You do that, though, you get more than the total U.S. budget. So I'm not sure where, I would draw the conclusion that he hit a few numbers on the keyboard until he saw something that looked pretty good, and that's what he's got. That's exactly misleading precision. Um, but his impression, he wants you to think that he's got, he's in the Oval Office and he's got some person doing really hard work here to come up with that. But the people that sort of have access to the information can't figure out where that's coming from. Uh, so and in the analysis of the time, lots of people said, "Look, this is clearly false precision." Uh, and the fact checker says nothing screams fake numbers than false precision. I saw this just this morning on my own social media feed from a friend, pretty reasonable guy under normal circumstances. Um, Looking at Manitoba's COVID stats. Uh, if you took total deaths of the population, so 19 total deaths over 1.2 million people, that's a survival rate of 99.99851%. And I don't quibble with the mathematics of that in the sense that if you divide 1.2 million into 19, you do get that number. We're not disputing the math. The methodology is crazy, right? You don't calculate a survival rate on the total population. You would want to do the number of deaths over the number of people infected. That number is given up here somewhere. 1,764 confirmed cases. So 1,900 into 1,700, or 19 into 1,700. That's a little bit more than 1 in 100. So that would be a 1% rate, right? So the way these numbers are presented, especially with this overlapped over the infographic that the province is supplying, creates a sense of confidence in the numbers. And the individual numbers here, I think, are accurate. But to say that there's a survival rate of 99% when I don't know what the infection rate is in Manitoba. Some people say it's more than the positive confirmed test rate. That's probably true even in Manitoba, certainly more true in other places. Manitobans have relatively strong access to tests, so there's probably relatively few number of people not tested that have it, but suppose that the number of confirmed cases was not 1,700, but double it, 3,000. So then you'd be at like 0.5% fatality rate or something. Calculating the death rate on the number of tests or the death rate on the total number of people in Manitoba, completely meaningless. The fact that you can get a very accurate number, who cares, right? No matter if a number doesn't mean anything, the number of decimals doesn't matter. So that's all we got to say about that. Next fallacy, naturalistic fallacy. This is one of my favorites because I sell honey. I'm standing there minding my own business, and people walk up to me at the farmer's market and say, "Is your honey natural?" And I say, "Yes." And they say, "So I should eat it?" And I say, "Oh, wait a minute," because they are committing exactly this mistake. This fallacy is an interesting one because it has a modern origin. This was a fallacy described in the 20th century very late 19th, early 20th century by a philosopher named G.E. Moore. He's most famous for being described as one of the characters in Alice in Wonderland in the original book. He's the dormouse when the author is using the book to have a little bit of fun with his colleagues at the university. And he's famous for being a pretty dry lecturer, so much so that he apparently fell asleep in his own lectures. So that sets the bar nice and low. I hope I'm doing a little better than that. But he worked in ethics, and he thinks that this is an ethical mistake, although I think it's generally speaking a mistake. And so let's go back. So the form is something is natural, therefore that thing is true, it is good, or is right. These are all sort of basic forms of the naturalistic fallacy. And clearly you could have, I don't really call it, a subcategory or a reverse naturalistic fallacy where something is unnatural, therefore it's wrong. And a lot of the way this works is you're really going to depend on what people think is natural, right? People tend to think of natural to be the world it was when I was growing up. And let's face it, for us, that's not even true, right? You guys are going to think of, lockdowns as in a different way than I do because I'm not going to have had it in a formative part of my life. So when we look at some specific examples, and here, remember my comments way on early in the course when I said, look, if an argument cuts both ways, probably not reliable. So I've set that up here. So, and these are quotes, and I'm sorry, this is old enough material that I've kind of lost track of where this came from. But the only natural relationship, so there's the claim that something's natural, that's the premise. The only natural relationship within marriage is one which can produce children, therefore gay marriage is wrong. And then opposing homosexuality is natural, it is something you're born with, therefore gay marriage is right. And let's not get bogged down in our view of the matter, but notice that both of them start with that same something is natural, therefore it's wrong or it's right. And the fact that those two opinions are clearly not in agreement with each other shows us that there must be something wrong with the argument. And so, and here's how I often, look at the way things are branded. Natural is a very common phrase on honey labels with a nice, Granny's Farm picture on the label. This is not my honey, by the way. I'm not advertising my own. But that's a pretty common way honey gets advertised. That might be a sign you see in a produce section of a grocery store. It's natural, so it's good, is the conclusion they want you to draw. But here's the problem. Here's Socrates about to drink the hemlock and kill himself. Now, in 300 BC, I can guarantee you that hemlock is artisanally grown, organic, non-GMO, whatever you want to say, it's natural, right? However you define natural, it's natural. Someone went out, probably down the street in Athens, and found some hemlock and picked it and brought it back. And despite the fact that it's perfectly natural product, it's going to kill it. And so natural does not mean good. If you want to simplify it even more, it's natural for bears to eat people, therefore it's good for bears to eat people. I think if you're the one being eaten, you probably disagree with that. We hear lots of political commentary focused on sort of human nature and point out that greed is natural and that therefore greed is good. There was I think a famous business advice book 15, 20 years ago. I think the Greed is Good was the title. Relies on the same basic intuition that natural somehow equates with good. You want a really horrible example? This one's going back a bit in time. This is a guy named William Harper who was, I think, a Confederate leader in he became a Confederate leader, but he's writing in 1830 in South Carolina, so this is about 30 years before the American Civil War. He argues that the order of nature and of God, that the being of superior faculties and knowledge, and therefore superior powers, should control and dispose of those who are inferior. Now, he doesn't say it, but he means it. Beings of superior faculties, those are the white people, and inferior, those are the blacks, and therefore it's okay for us to own them as slaves, is clearly the message here. Oh boy, right? No one wants that. So, well, or I don't know, I used to think no one wanted that, now I'm not so sure. Let's hope no one wants that. And now notice what he's saying is, hey, William Harper is looking the world around him and saying, this is the way things should be, right? This is natural. This is normal. And let's not change it. That is a pretty natural human reaction. Um, the fact that in this case it's in defense of something so horrible it's even difficult to talk about, um, I think is a sign that natural is not a good thing. Uh, we, of course, prefer normal or natural to the alternative. Um, our own life histories tends to inform us of what we think is natural and what is normal. In fact, natural is going to be highly contextual. Um, the way I produce honey, is it natural? Well, honeybees aren't native to North America, so is it natural? Probably not. Do I add things to it? No. So what we mean natural is going to really depend on what you think natural should be. And it's such a vague term that it really doesn't mean very much. Where would we categorize this? And we've struggled with this a little bit um, as we've gone on, right? So I kind of presented as this: there's these three categories, right? There's relevance, presumption, and ambiguity, as if those are the three sets of fallacies, and it's not that simple, unfortunately. I would think that this naturalistic fallacy really is some sort of fallacy of relevance. I don't see very many authors categorize it that way. I think partly because it's new. In philosophy, 150 years is new. Um, but I think it's, there's no relevance between something being natural and it being good. So I think it's a fallacy of relevance. Texas Sharpshooter fallacy. Oh, this is a fun one. First of all, let's just look at the name. The name is, notice this Texan, we assume he's Texan because he's got a big hat. And he's standing there with his gun smoking, and he's got his assistant drawing bullseyes around wherever he happened to hit the barn a little bit more frequently. That's the key concept of the Texas sharpshooter, where you're picking your data after rather than before your experiment. So that it's also called statistical clustering, sometimes called cherry picking. And this is when you infer from a cluster of results to make a causal claim. So back when SARS was a thing, SARS was the pandemic that could have been about 20 years ago. Most of the victims in Canada had been patients at a particular Toronto emergency room, and so many people thought that that's where they had been infected because they had that commonality. Turned out it wasn't the case. They'd all been on or contacted with someone who'd been on a specific airplane flight. The fact that there was sort of commonality of cultural grouping within the airplane flight and then within the region of Toronto in which they lived meant that they all showed up at one particular emergency room. So here's Mr. Trump cherry picking his data. He wants to rule out data from a certain place and time, right? So he's talking about COVID numbers. He says a lot of our numbers are based on New York and New Jersey, that particular area. And when you take them out, just as an example, take a look at Florida relative to New York, which is a bit of a tangent. And I've consolidated this quote down. He tends to ramble a little bit, so you kind of gotta tighten the quote up. Anyone who wants to go, if you just Google Trump for August 4th, you'll find the full quote. When you take that out, our numbers are among the lowest. So in other words, if you throw out a bunch of data, that makes us look better. Well, of course. Now, the funny thing is, even if you throw out all the data he wants to throw out, it turns out it's still not good. But it's a noble try. Let's give him that. So that's exactly what cherry picking is. If we choose the data we want, we can get the result we want, is the basic picture there. You often hear this cherry picking leveled as an accusation towards something like Black Lives Matter, where, let's face it, most of us understand the issue through a relatively small number of cases, right? So we saw the George Floyd video, we heard about Breonna Taylor, and we're like, oh my goodness, this is horrible. And I think it's a fair criticism if that was all there was to it, to say you're selecting a small number of cases that that accentuate a particular issue. So, if you look at violence in America in general, you might get a different point of view. And so that facilitates the criticism that Black Lives Matter is really a problem of a few bad apples. Most police officers are good. There's only a relatively small number that have a problem. So what do we think about that, right? Because so here's cherry picking being pointed out as a defense of perhaps the status quo. Um, and I suggest, it's a fair criticism in the sense that if it were true that that was all there was to it, then it would be cherry picking. Um, I invite you to do a little digging. If you look into the data, police shootings, black men versus white men, um, where they happen, urban versus rural. There's all sorts of interesting digging you can do. I think you'll realize fairly quickly that the cherry picking accusation is not fair. That there is a lot of statistical evidence to show that there's a serious problem there. Okay? So if in general a cherry picking, say, haha, that's the fallacy of cherry picking, I think the right response is not to say, no, it's not, but rather to say, let's go get the data. Let's find out. Where would we put cherry picking? I think this is a typical fallacy of induction. So it's really a fallacy that's coming. So that's why I didn't get into the numbers here, because we got a lot of work to do before we get to that. So the last portion of the course, we'll look at cherry picking more carefully. Another fun one is wishful thinking. And this might just be a particular form of appeal to emotion, where the emotion is just your own desire. I want something to be true, therefore it is true. As an example, there's got to be an error here in the history book. It says that Sir John A. Macdonald was a drunk. I don't believe it. He was our first PM and our best prime minister, and any good prime minister would never drink to excess. That would be awful. Okay? So since I don't want something to be true, it must not be true. The evidence is how I feel about it. The conclusion is some fact. Facts don't work like that. So here's Donald Trump on the coronavirus. Coronavirus, now this is February 25th. So we got enough data now to know that, things aren't under control. You may ask about the coronavirus, which is very well under control in our country. We have very few people with it. And the people that have it are getting better. They're all getting better. As far as what we're doing with the new virus, I think that we're doing a great job. Okay? Now, did we want that to be true? Totally. Does Donald Trump want that to be true? Totally. You've probably met people. You might be a person who's it's all a hoax. It's overblown. There's nothing to it. As my friend with the false statistics seems to be heading. Man, wouldn't it be fantastic if it were true? But it's not true. So that's wishful thinking. Wanting it doesn't make it so. And yet, oh boy, wouldn't it be nice? In sports, a lot of wishful thinking. And this is, so here is, I call it a counterexample, because I forget what year this picture's from. But there's the Canadian junior hockey team with silver medals around their necks, which, in Canada is not good enough. And my desire to have Canada win the World Cup was high. I really believed, I really wanted it to be true, and unfortunately it wasn't the case. And yet at the same time, sports, high performance athletes, students, bison athletes that are regularly in my classes report that they're trained and see as an important part of their training uh, what looks to me like wishful thinking. They're told, visualize yourself on the podium, visualize yourself kicking that ball through the uprights. Um, and the athletes report, boy, that really helps. Um, Sports psychology is a growing field, and which is, oh boy, to me as a logic guy, seems like wishful thinking. Which is it? Is it something that works, or is it something that is bad logic? Could be both. Um, and probably, I mean, the amount of training you need to be a high performance athlete is unbelievable. Probably easier to drag yourself out of bed at 5:30 in the morning if you meditated upon the glory of yourself on the podium, the success of your endeavor. I don't know. I think this is probably a false cause situation with this sports psychology stuff, where it's not that the wishful thinking caused you to succeed, the wishful thinking caused you to train harder because you've had a more positive attitude. That's probably what's really going on there. I'm tempted to think of wishful thinking as a root or a foundational fallacy. After all, we know very well that the extent to which these fallacies can draw us in depends heavily on our own biases, our own inclinations. Um, it's very much easier to pull someone in with a fallacy if they're already part of the way in, right? So if you're telling people things they want to believe, they'll take almost any crappy reason for it. And that's, you know, the secret of Donald Trump's genius, right? Is he has really crappy arguments, but he's really good at figuring out what people want to hear. And so he's three-quarters of the way there. In fact, Trump is probably, I think the language people is a permission structure. By being who he is, he allows other people to have their own views that are similar. We all have our own cognitive biases. You could teach logic for 30 years and still, get trapped into what. Um, so, when I teach critical thinking, I say you're never going to get rid of your cognitive biases. Instead, you should treat them as a bit of a red flag. If you find yourself very quickly and without much evidence adopting a belief, you should say, wait a minute. Am I just believing this just because I want to? Is there another perspective I should consider? Um, so, in some ways, wishful thinking is the layer upon which all of our other reasoning mistakes can kind of be built upon. If someone doesn't want to believe something you're trying to tell them, I don't think any amount of fallacies will get them there. But if they already want to believe, they want to believe that COVID is going to go away on its own. They want to believe that this is a harmless disease. It's no worse than the flu or driving a car. Um, Boy, you don't need much to get them there. And so, wishful thinking, I think, is a very important concept. Last one I want to do is called the Fallacy Fallacy, or in Latin would be the argument from logic ad logicum. And this is its own sort of logic trap. Remember, I hope, and it's pretty normal that by this point of the course, you guys, my students, are being totally annoying to the people around you. Your parents, I guess that's the only people you're going to see these days, and your family members. You're going to say, hey, that's a fallacy. Therefore, you're wrong. Now, you got to stop right there because that's not good thinking in itself. It could be true that it's a fallacy and it could still be correct. Like the conclusion of a fallacious argument can still be true. In the example, your argument for an economic stimulus rests on an ad baculum fallacy. Okay, you say, hey, if you don't want to accept my economic plan, the country's gonna go to ruin. That's a threat. Therefore, there is no need for an economic stimulus, right? Whoa. I think we all know we need that, even if the reason being given for it is not a good one. I'll try to do a really obvious example here. So, let's suppose Rihanna says she's probably, homeschooling or something. I forget if she has kids or not. Maybe let's in my imagination, she's explaining something to physics to kids. And so she says that the force of gravitational attraction is inversely proportional to the distance between the objects considered. And I tell you, you should believe that because Rihanna says so. Okay? So I think you would recognize that that's a false authority. Rihanna, a fabulous singer, physicist, probably average. So at the same time, this is the inverse square law that gravitational works on, right? So this is true even if me saying you should believe it because Rihanna says so is not a good reason. So the fact that I've used a fallacy is not evidence that the conclusion is false. So why does the fallacy fallacy work? Right? Why do you go so quickly from aha, that's a fallacy to you must be wrong? Probably this is a fallacy of relevance. This is an argument that includes a fallacy. That's a good reason to reject the argument. So you hear an argument, it's got a fallacy. Should you believe the conclusion? No. So when you reject an argument, you don't reject the conclusion, you reject the whole package. Those premises don't lead to that conclusion, is what you should conclude, which is not the same as rejecting the conclusion. So someone gives you a bad reason to believe something. You reject the reasons, you shouldn't reject the conclusion. And you can coin a fallacious argument for any conclusion, right? So, and in class, I think we'll try to practice this a little bit, but let's try. Let's think of, right now, we'll take a random idea like it's raining outside. We'll turn the camera in the middle in a moment and see. And we'll say, well, I really wish it wasn't raining right now. Okay? And it's not. So, bad argument, it's a fallacy, doesn't mean the conclusion's false. So, you can, the fallacies are infinite, they're everywhere, but lots of things are true. And so, just having a fallacy doesn't mean someone's wrong. If someone uses a fallacy, might be because they're remember the example of the speeding threat, which I said was a fallacy, right? If you speed here, you'll be fined. It's a fallacy. Doesn't mean it's not true that you shouldn't speed there. Instead, what it means is someone's decided, well, this is really the best way to convince people. And so when you hear a fallacy, you should say, someone's trying to manipulate me. Why? And should I use, in my own good time and for my own good reasons, accept the belief that they propose, or should I reject it? That's the attitude you should have when you confront a fallacy, not to immediately leap to everything is false. So Look at the difference. Quoting Rihanna is not a good reason to believe that gravity operates according to the inverse square law. Compare that to it is false that gravity operates according to the inverse square law. Okay? This is true, and this is not a belief you want to have. Okay? That's pretty much it for informal fallacies. I thought it'd be useful just to offer some insight into how one should work through this material. So for each fallacy we've covered, you should have the form, that's the basic structure of the argument, and probably have a simple example you could come to. You don't have to have it memorized, but you should be able to recall it in with a little bit of work, right? So you say, oh, yes, I know the form, and so if this was dogs and cats, it would work like, certain thing, right? If I'm talking about the fallacy, oh yeah, that was the Rihanna example. How did that go again? You can kind of work it out, okay? The questions in if you have the textbook, the questions in chapter 5 are worth working through. If you're working in an alternate text, find the chapter that is on informal fallacies. Most logic textbooks tend to kind of lump them into one category there and do them together. Notice that if you're using an alternate text, the fallacies that I've covered might not be exactly the same as the text that you're looking at, so you're going to have to adjust that accordingly. And also do your assignment. Maybe that seems obvious, but notice in the assignment I'm asking you to create the fallacies. I find that builds higher confidence in how they work than just most textbooks are, which fallacy is this, which fallacy is this. And we're going to do that on the first quiz. But when you write them, you get kind of in behind and see how they work, how someone would use it. Some resources, and I'll put this up on the UM Learn, but there's a critical thinking page by Joe Lau at Hong Kong University, and his page is available in both Chinese and English, and I'm told that it's quite excellent in Chinese as well, so I recommend that if that would be useful to you. There's some fallacy resources at the OWL Purdue writing site, and that write-up is quite good. There's a website called Logic Toolbox by a guy named John Setti, who is quite good, and he's got exercises to do. So that's a good place to start. That's it for today. Have a great day.